we have Logan Barrett, who's the Director of History and Collections at the National Civil War Naval Museum in Columbus, Georgia. He holds a master's degree in history from the University of Alabama at Birmingham, and he's a PhD candidate at Auburn University. His research focuses on civil rights, labor, industry, and urban development. Everyone, please help me in welcoming Logan Barrett to the Georgia Archives.
Thank you so much. So you might have noticed from Robin's introduction of me, I am consider myself first and foremost a labor historian and also an urban historian. So I am not a military historian, although I do direct the interpretation of history at the National Civil War Naval Museum. That is all to say that if you came expecting a talk of, big Civil War battles, Johnny Reb versus Billy Yank, I hate to disappoint, but that's not what I'm here to present today, but hopefully still captures your attention. All right, so the National Civil War Naval Museum is in Columbus, Georgia, right in the lower Chattahoochee fault line. So that it's been mentioned a few times in previous talks today, but the Chattahoochee River below the fault line at the 𝘑𝘢𝘤𝘬𝘢𝘮𝘦 Falls ends up meeting up with the 𝘑𝘢𝘤𝘬𝘀 River system down to Florida, and that's your entry point into the Gulf of Mexico. This ends up being a very significant industrial city for that region, the Chattahoochee Valley region. Of kind of southwestern Georgia, southeastern Alabama, and over. So Columbus ends up having a pretty close working relationship with both 𝘑𝘢𝘬𝘀, Florida, but also over to Montgomery, Alabama during the antebellum period. So European contact in that region, which was originally settled by the Muskogee Creek, English traders made contact with those indigenous peoples in the 1680s, so right towards the end of the 17th century. The English do have a pretty strong trading relationship with the Muskogee Creek. That is not maintained post-revolution. Once you have Americans with dreams of Western expansion start to take hold and populate that region, those relations pretty quickly dissolve into conflict. There is the Creek War, which is a regional conflict of that War of 1812. At the end of the war, the Creek were forced to cede that land in southern Georgia. There ends up being the Treaty of Indian Springs, which is signed in 1825, and that the indigenous people are basically coerced into signing this treaty after the Creek War, are forced off of their land, and this land includes where Columbus now sits. So Columbus in the antebellum period does become a significant early industrialization market. So industrialization in the South is usually thought of as a post-Civil War New South idea, but you do start to see that and that that boosterism that is associated with New South ideas as well, especially in Atlanta. That's already existing before the Civil War. So the city newspapers are already promoting Columbus as the Lowell of the South, so a reference to Lowell, Massachusetts, kind of that textile empire of New England. So Columbus wants to frame itself as a textile empire of the South. So not only for the cotton markets of cotton plantations that fill the region, but also that cotton production into textile goods as well. Even as you have the expansion of railroad systems by the 1840s and 1850s through here, the Chattahoochee River still maintains its significance in and around Columbus. You have both that connection down once again to the 𝘑𝘢𝘬𝘀 system, so that's introducing those textiles and cotton goods into more global markets through the Gulf of Mexico. but also you are using the industrialists in Columbus are using the Chattahoochee River, those fall line at the Coetta Falls to really harness that water power as a source of energy for that industrial production. And of course, there ends up being quite heavy amount of environmental degradation, which is always associated with industrial revolutionizing of an urban space. But there's lots of dams constructed around this part of the Chattahoochee, and you have lots of mills producing textile goods. You have foundries producing iron goods. You have an assortment of industry, much more than you would potentially expect thinking of the antebellum period in the South. Between 1830 and 1850, the city's population increased from just over a little over 1,000 to over 5,000. And leading right up to the beginning of the Civil War in 1860, Columbus was the third largest city in Georgia. It was behind only Savannah, #1, and Augusta, #2. So Columbus was even larger than fourth place Atlanta at the time before the Civil War gets going. So probably one of the most common questions that people ask when they visit the National Civil War Naval Museum is why in the world is there a naval museum about 200 miles inland in Columbus? And that's really a result of, by 1862, the Confederate Navy had been largely decimated from the what was called the Anaconda Plan of the United States military. So just really brief, not to get too bogged down in the weeds. The Anaconda Plan was this idea of having ships blockade all of the southern ports and literally, like an anaconda snake, choke off the southern economy and basically ruin both the literal ability of the South to fight, but also the morale of the Confederacy to continue to fight. So as that blockade is really starting to succeed and have a chokehold on Confederate port cities, the Confederate Navy, which the Secretary of the Navy is Stephen Mallory, he decides to move all Confederate naval production inland along river systems in places like Columbus. So Columbus actually ends up being second to only Richmond in overall industrial production by the Confederacy, but also Columbus becomes the Confederate industrial arm's most important location in the entire rebelling South. So you have multiple representations of Confederate government and industry in Columbus. Two of your leaders are Chief Engineer James Warner and then Lieutenant Augustus McLaughlin. So they're over kind of co-leaders. They neither one of them is on a hierarchical chain of command above the other. They're really working as co-collaborators. But James Warner is over what is the Columbus Naval Iron Works. And then Augustus McLaughlin here on the right was over the Confederate Navy Yard. So Warner, which I realize the image is not great, but as I try to explain, that's the only known photograph of him. So we can probably go ahead and assume he didn't look quite like a ghost in life, but that's what we got. So Warner was actually born in 1830, but so he was born in Virginia, but actually was raised in Ohio. So he's kind of your example of a Northerner who becomes a Confederate. And that goes kind of is illustrative or indicative of the fact that he was really a career naval man. So like these regional identities that you would think would inform who you would fight for when the Civil War breaks out, those are very much less concrete amongst sailors who are really traveling all over the world, right? They're more associating their identity with life at sea than they are with like a hometown. So Warner's from really grows up in Ohio. He had been the chief engineer of the United States Navy Yard in Norfolk, Virginia, until he decides to leave the United States Navy when the Confederacy is formed. And then also you have, so Augustus McLaughlin, similar situation. He was from Maryland. So one of those border states that never technically seceded, but still a state that is defined by its society as it's a slave society. So he's from Baltimore, but ends up being in the United States Navy from the time of being a young child. So the Navy is bringing in what would be called powder monkeys or boys as a rank as young as 10 years old. By the time that he ends up leaving the United States Navy and joining the Confederate Navy once the Civil War breaks out. Although Warner does have experience as that engineer of ship development, interestingly, McLaughlin rises through the ranks of the Navy, but he had prior to the war and prior to his arrival at the Confederate Navy Yard, no experience in ship development. So the main product that the Columbus, both the Naval Iron Works and the Confederate Navy Yard ended up producing is the CSS Jackson. So this is an ironclad ram. You might notice it looks almost kind of like a barn, right? It's like a floating barn, which some people criticized the look of an ironclad as being very barn-like. There's a reason for that. I'll explain in just a moment of why it looked as it did. But it's the ships by the Civil War are really moving away from being just like these old oaken and sailed vessels that you see through the the American Revolution, or in popular culture we might think of like pirate ships and these kind of things with sails and all this. As you can see by the Civil War, going through this industrial, very much steam and iron age, the ships are looking very drastically different. The CSS Jackson was the primary vessel constructed in Columbus, and then your second one is the CSS Chattahoochee, which what ended up being the only ship that patrolled the Chattahoochee River down to Apalachicola. You'll notice this might be a little bit more what we're used to thinking of all of these old vessels. This was converted from being a sailing ship to it also had steam engines. The Chattahoochee ended up being built about 60 miles south of Columbus, originally in Saffold, Georgia, and then had a putting it nicely, an unremarkable career patrolling the Apalachicola River. And it's probably its most famous event was not at all a positive one. After a hurricane came through the region, the steam engines ended up overflowing, and it caused a boiler explosion in which 19 of the sailors of the crew ended up dying. And that basically halted the ship's ability to continue to patrol the Chattahoochee River. It ends up being brought to Columbus to be re-outfitted. And that, I guess that's all to say that it's important. The CSS Jackson and the CSS Chattahoochee, those are really the two primary ships that compose what kind of was vernacularly known as the Chattahoochee River Squadron. So like a squadron of ships. It's not quite a fleet, much smaller. In this case, we're literally talking about two boats. Not a whole lot of success during the war. So wartime endings, you notice in my subtitle of my talk, there's really not, if you're looking for a bunch of wartime glory, these ships are not the place to look. The Jackson ends up actually being a source of frustration for its multi-year process of being built. And then, of course, the Chattahoochee had the boiler explosion and then was also kind of stuck in this weird limbo state in Columbus being re-outfitted. So labor in wartime Columbus. McLaughlin and Warner, I guess I should go ahead and wear my labor historian on my sleeves here. They are not great bosses to work for a variety of reasons. First of all, the Columbus Navy is employing, and by that I mean not paid, but utilizing enslaved labor of the region. So we see here in this lower right on this slide, Chief Engineer J.H. Warner offers $500 reward for a Negro who ran away from the Naval Ironworks. So this is, kind of your quintessential example of what would be what historians used to refer to as runaway slaves, now would be referred to as a freedom seeker, right? We're decriminalizing that action as somebody, self-liberating, going towards freedom. Warner is trying to put a stop to that, putting out what would have been called, your traditional runaway ad. These proliferate antebellum, going back to the colonial period in the American South, as you have freedom seekers heading northward, heading southward in many cases. A lot of freedom seekers from Columbus would actually be heading towards south towards Mexico or over to blockade ships. You also have poor white workers that are given. So if you're working in industry, an important production for the Confederate war effort, you are not obligated to also have served military, frontline active duty military experience. So this is a way for poor white men to avoid going off to battle. That being said, you see here this notice. So this is Warner once again placing an ad in a newspaper complaining about these white men that are trying to leave ironworks and seek employment elsewhere because they don't like the conditions in the ironworks. Warner is kind of, in this example, he is saying to other industrial leaders, hey, these guys left, they stopped their work contract with me, do not give them another job, right? So you are restricting a worker's ability to go and find employment elsewhere, which in many times is your best strategy if you're not happy in the job you're in. The second thing he would do was often threaten to turn these names over to the Confederate Army, telling them, hey, I'm going to send you to those front lines. You're going to go to the battle and you will die in one of these, land battles up in Virginia. On the left here, I wanted to talk about Horace King. Is anybody here familiar with Horace King? He's so Horace King through Southwest Georgia and then into Alabama and even Mississippi. He ends up being the story of he's formerly enslaved. He ends up in a weird, I won't get into it, legal battle, ends up purchasing his own freedom. He is celebrated throughout those southern states as this example of a formerly enslaved person who is this genius master bridge builder. So he builds covered bridges throughout multiple states, including several crossing the Chattahoochee River from Girard, Alabama, which is present-day Phoenix City, which is where he lived, into Columbus, right across the river. Horace King was coerced into supplying both lumber and labor to the Confederate Navy. Confederate apologists today try to use Horace King as an example of here's a black man that is rah-rah Confederacy. That's very much not the case. And in fact, my notes all got jumbled up here, but let me find it real quick, just to kind of drive home the point. So just in case there's any ambiguity of Horace King supporting the Confederacy. So after the war, he said, "I stood on the Union side and always begged and talked for the Union." He also remembered, "I was always told to hush, that the people would kill me for talking against the Confederacy." So if there's any confusion over Horace King's where his loyalties lie, it was not with the Confederate cause of fighting for slavery. He ends up not only giving his own labor and lumber to the Confederate Navy Yard, he also ends up having his sons both work there. That was because he was terrified of them being conscripted into the Confederate Army, not as soldiers, but as laborers. And then finally, also in the bottom left, this is one of the textile mills, Eagle Manufacturing Company. It's requesting hiring both men and boys, but also women. There is this history of, so the textile industry in particular, going back to the Lowell system of hiring what were called needle girls, which were younger white women to be employed as textile workers. The textile industry is really that one exception to other industry where you don't see enslaved workers. And that's because of racialized sexual anxieties of you don't want young white women working in the same place as enslaved Black men. So you have the enslaved men are working in places like the Navy Yard, at the ironworks, and other industry throughout Columbus and elsewhere throughout the South, but not in the textile mills. Okay, so the Jackson, as I kind of hinted, it was a not super successful build. The original plans called for a barn-like ironclad to be powered by a center-positioned paddle wheel. There was only one other example of this during the time of the Civil War. That was the CSS 𝘊𝘐𝘅𝘢𝘬𝘴𝘰𝘯. So they were trying to copy that. So it was going to be, this river flowing on the Chattahoochee, literally what they would call a floating fortress, covered in about 8 inches of pine and oak, and then layered with 4 inches of iron on top. The original engines to control that paddle wheel were salvaged from the Time, which was a steamboat constructed before the war. And this ended up being really not a great idea. That heavy casemate, that heavy ironclad could not be powered by the paddle wheel design. This is the only remaining very, very small portion of the overall blueprints of, I think he's on the next slide, John Porter's blueprints for the Jackson. So we're seeing like a side profile of the casemate here. So we see a little bit of the lumber, and then this is going to be your iron. So like literally the ironclad, of course, above water, and then this is at the water line. So below that portion would be underwater on the vessel, assuming everything went great. So after about a year of building, McLaughlin is excited and writes, we're ready to arm this thing, bring cannons from Selma. So the Jackson ended up having 6 what were called Burke rifles that were built by the Confederate Navy Ironworks in Selma. He's saying, hey, we're ready for the guns. We're ready to put this floating fortress to work. One little problem. The Chattahoochee River did not cooperate, and they could not launch the ship. They tried several times. They couldn't get it off the docks. There ended up being very high, heavy rain in this period. It raised the river over 10 feet, and literally jammed this heavy ironclad where they couldn't get it off. You have breakers on the docks, and they couldn't get it over that. I'm going to keep on hitting this the whole time, I guess. That's just the goal. So what they think after this, they kind of regroup. Porter, who is pictured here, the constructor, and he's kind of the overseer, brought down from Richmond to observe like what's the problem at this point. McLaughlin and Warner are pretty much convinced that this is going to be just, he's going to come and look at it, say like, oh yeah, the weather was bad, that was unfortunate, but we'll regroup and try again in a couple of weeks. Instead, Porter orders a complete redesign and rebuild. He ends up shortening the length of the casemate. So that iron, like literally that iron armor around the top portion of the vessel. And then he gets rid of that paddle wheel design. He says, we're going to switch to 2 screws. So that's kind of, so a screw system is what you probably think of as like a giant propeller, right? So you think of, there's a picture towards the end of my PowerPoint that'll probably better show that. But 2 screws, just think about moving away from paddle wheel to propellers. But okay, so finally, after 2 years of building, and by this point, McLaughlin and Warner are like pulling their hair out. I'm pretty sure they're kind of going mad. At one point, Warner starts doodling like this idea of like, the next ironclad I build is going to have a tower on it. It's going to be like a double-decker ironclad. So kind of like these, like these crazy like mind inventions of what he can imagine he's going to do next instead, because they're just so frustrated that we're still just building the Jackson and we wanted to build, multiple vessels here. So one newspaper is, pretty excited about it. Probably not coincidentally the same newspaper that called it the Lull of the South. This splendid ram was successfully launched yesterday at about 11 o'clock and now sits as calmly upon the Chattahoochee as a duck upon a pond. Those capable of judging who have examined the craft inform us that she is one of the snuggest and most compact and securely built craft yet afloat upon our waters. So that sounds great. But then your other newspaper in town also says, this boat has been building here for over 2 years and has cost enough to build a number of Alabamas. So the Alabama, that's referring to the CSS 𝘊𝘩𝘢𝘬𝘢𝘕 which was a Confederate raider, became kind of iconic symbol of successful Confederate Navy, unlike what was seen on the Chattahoochee River. So the CSS 𝘊𝘩𝘢𝘊𝘩𝘢𝘕 was a commerce raider operating in the Atlantic even over to Europe, basically disrupting U.S. merchant vessels. Eventually, the CSS 𝘊𝘩𝘊𝘢𝘊𝘩𝘢𝘕 ends up meeting its fate off the coast of Cherbourg, France, and ends up being sank by the USS Kearsarge. But that's another story. Basically voicing a lot of frustration of like, look how many resources have been poured into the Jackson for not much to show. And after 2 years of building, so the Jackson is finally, actually floating in the Chattahoochee River. So we got some progress here. Despite all the efforts by Warner and McLaughlin to get the CSS Jackson out of Columbus, once they hear that U.S. Cavalry General James Wilson is making his way through Alabama. At one point, Confederate defenders, so the general of land forces in Columbus was Hal Cobb. Wilson was literally in Montgomery, and Hal Cobb was saying, like, they're not going to come to Columbus. That's surely not their next move. So then they took Selma. They're not going to come to Columbus after Selma. That's not what they're going to do. And then 2 days later, James Wilson, during the battle, but more of, a glorified skirmish. Hey, anybody here that was here for a Civil War battle, there's your little battle mentioned. There was the Battle of Columbus. It was a night battle. It only lasted a couple of hours. Wilson's cavalry ends up capturing the city. Most of the industry of the city is burned, including after the cavalry make like this meticulous report detailing every detail about the Jackson. And then they soaked it in turpentine and lit it on fire. And it burned for almost 2 weeks, about 12 days, ended up floating about 30 miles downriver on the Chattahoochee, and ended up, it was burnt to the water line, the below the water line, ended up being a wreck at the bottom of the Chattahoochee River. So the CSS Chattahoochee, that gunboat, the Confederacy, the very few remaining sailors that were left on the Chattahoochee, they hear about what's happened during the Battle of Columbus, and then also the burning of the Jackson. And to keep it out of Wilson's cavalry hands, but really just doing what they were going to do as jobs for them, the Confederacy do what's called scuttling the ship. That's when you burn your own ship on purpose so it falls out, so it's not captured by enemy hands. But since what we saw with the Jackson, the cavalry were going to burn the Chattahoochee too. So, just doing their job for them. So you're like, man, wow, this whole talk is about how Columbus was like a huge failure, right? And I would argue that militarily, although it was the second largest, just after Richmond, Confederate industrial center during the war, militarily, the Confederate Navy and other Confederate industry in Columbus largely have very few successes to point to and pat themselves on the back for. But I want to argue that for both good and bad, this industry that was developed before the war and then certainly reached new heights during wartime did influence the New South. So conventional wisdom tells us that after the war, the Civil War caused this economic decline for decades upon decades, and still the South feels the impact of this decline. And in some ways that's true, of course. The agrarian society is over. You have the liberation of enslaved people. So you have entire economic and social systems of the South are overturned. However, you also have the massive expansion of industry during the Civil War that takes, several steps forward during the war, maybe a few steps backwards because of being destroyed, certainly Atlanta being an example. But then relatively quickly, you have a significant recovery. And Columbus has maybe one of the more miraculous, surprising recoveries in terms of industrial commerce than any other city in the South. Within just a few months, about 6 months, the Columbus Iron Works, which had been the Naval Iron Works, is back being a privately owned commercial institution producing iron goods again. Ends up becoming famous for producing, this was later on into the 20th century, but produces ice boxes and basically refrigerators. Eagle Mill, one of those textile mills famous before the war, it comes back as Eagle and Phoenix. So Phoenix, of course, representing it's this rebirth of the textile industry in Columbus. That's only after a couple of years as well. So this is your Eagle and Phoenix mills, one of the largest employers during this the late 19th century New South period in the South. There's multiple thousand employees at this textile mill. It's absolutely massive. And of course, this influences Girard, Alabama, renaming Phoenix City after the mill. So what happens to our leaders? So James Warner, he doesn't live much longer after the war. So Columbus, during the social and military reconstruction period, so just in 1866, a year after the war has ended, he's involved, well, I should say he's an innocent bystander to some degrees. There's a racial conflict between, there's the occupying force in Columbus are what were members of the USCT, so the United States Colored Troops. So they're Black soldiers a lot of the citizens of Columbus are very uncomfortable, to say the least, with being occupied by Black U.S. soldiers, kind of really rubbing the salt in the wound of defeat and the end of slavery in the region. So there's a fight going on between them. Not exactly sure who fired first, but there ends up being one round hits Warner, and he ends up dying pretty quickly after that. I say he's an innocent bystander. As far as we know, historians do not believe he was part of those tensions of the fighting between the groups, largely because right after the war is over, Warner goes back to working with the United States government to turn over all of the remaining supplies that are still at the Columbus Iron Works to the United States Navy. So he wasn't involved, we believe, because of his renewed loyalty to the United States military. McLaughlin ends up surviving. He was captured during the battle, ends up being paroled, and he goes back to Baltimore, where he ends up dying in 1884. But for better or for worse, you know, there's also a significant continuum of labor conditions that we saw in the antebellum and through the wartime period. The New South, Jim Crow laws go into effect. That, of course, involves heavy amounts of exploitation of Black labor. So you have these enslaved people that are part of industrial slavery that just continue on being part of the industrialized New South. You also have the continuation of the exploitation of these needle girls, you know, these textile mill hands, which are largely being used in the textile industry because the belief by the industrialists is of, you know, we can pay these women less than we would pay men. So a lot of these continuations that we see from the war, certainly both racial and gender biases apply into New South industry as well. But you also have connections networking the New South together. So that's an important part of like this urbanization, this industrialized economy throughout the South, are these connections of commerce and capitalism throughout these cities. So the Jackson was outfitted. I mentioned the Selma Naval Iron Works produced the 6 Brooke rifles that armed the Jackson. So this is actually after Wilson burned down those ironworks. But that relationship with Selma and industry in Selma also continued. The Shelby Iron Works supplied a lot of the iron that was used in that armor plating for the Jackson. So Birmingham didn't exist during the time of the Civil War, but there was coal fields and iron production within that region. And then finally, you have this cannon lathe. So this is basically the machine that rolls a cannon barrel and produces a cannon. This cannon lathe originated in Selma, ended up in Birmingham at the outside of what became Birmingham. Birmingham didn't exist yet, as I mentioned, during the war, and then was brought to Columbus and was used producing cannons at the Naval Iron Works in Columbus. And then after the war, it was sold to Birmingham industrialists, was used at the Birmingham rolling mill, no longer producing cannons, but producing cast iron pipes. And then eventually in the 20th century, the lathe was donated to Alabama Polytechnic Institute, which later became Auburn University. The ship remains. So they were both the Jackson and Chattahoochee remained at the bottom of the river for almost 100 years. And then local Civil War enthusiasts, basically when they realized the centennial of the war was fast approaching, they're super excited about any local Civil War connection. And they start talking to this group of local fishermen who were collectively known as the river rats, who were like, yeah, we've been using the remains of that Confederate gunboat to fish off of. And so that began the process of recovering the ships. Just like the building of the Jackson itself, it ends up being a multi-year process that begins in 1960. And they don't have the two sections that they end up having to bring the Jackson up in. They don't have those out of the river and on land until 1963, after multiple failed attempts to lift by crane out of the river. Two dynamite incidences that would probably have most preservationists absolutely stunned. So the ship is in two halves, partially because one of the ideas is, hey, let's dynamite blast this thing out of the riverbed. So the 1960s, a little bit of amateur hour in terms of the recovery of the ships, but the Chattahoochee is also recovered by 1965, and they both end up in the National Civil War Naval Museum, which has existed since 2001. So prior to that, there was another institution that housed them. But in 2001, they moved to the National Civil War Naval Museum, where we see the remains of those ships today. So those are the screws I was mentioning in the top left. So those are on display. That's the back portion of the Jackson. Below that, you see kind of a semi-bird's eye view of the length of the Jackson. This is a massive, like the building that the gallery that houses the Jackson was literally designed as like what an airplane hangar was. So once they built that and one end was open, they brought the Jackson in, and then they bricked the last remaining wall in. And then in the middle photo here, that is the remains of the Chattahoochee. These are the two of the engines, not the ones that blew up, but rather the ones from Columbus of the Chattahoochee gunboat. And then below that, finally, is one of the Burke rifles off the Jackson that the museum still pretty regularly fires today. In fact, we just had our big spring event last weekend, and we fired that gun 5 times. As far as I know, we're the only museum that's still firing a Civil War era cannon. All right, so thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions. Yeah, right here, and then go back.
So how much bigger is the Chattahoochee down at Columbus versus a bit more north? So like what's the largest ships that could navigate around the Columbus area?
Yeah, so in terms of there is at the 𝑘owetah Fall line, there is a wider portion of the river. It ends up, once you get closer towards Apalachicola, that's literally called the Narrows. I think what you might be getting at is, so if the Jackson is like this big, how is it going to float in the river? Is that kind of what your question is leaning to? So I don't have the exact numbers on like how wide the river is, but the Jackson was too big. That was part of the failures of the Jackson was, so like also the draft of the Jackson at best was like 8, so it was about 8 to 10 feet draft. So the underwater portion of the ship. There's multiple parts of the lower Chattahoochee that are only about 8 feet deep. So that was like very optimistic that the floating barn was ever going to move anywhere. Yeah, and then I think back here, and then
So Wilson burned the Jackson, but I didn't understand what happened to the Chattahoochee.
So the Confederate Navy, the remaining sailors that were on the Chattahoochee, they scuttled it, which meant they burned it themselves. They were trying to prevent it from being captured. Because the engines hadn't been fully operational yet, there was actually a tugboat that had to pull the Chattahoochee. So the Chattahoochee couldn't move on its own, so they didn't try to escape. They just they destroyed it on purpose. Yeah.
This talk would have just been a little better tomorrow, which is the anniversary of the beginning of the Civil War.
Yeah, yeah.
I heard that they're kind of trying to reconstruct the waterfalls there at Columbus?
Yeah, so there's been multiple, so there's a lot of, recreational use around the falls. Now, there's also been a lot of development, so all of the textile mills and everything that we see along here, a lot of those have been turned into it's the same thing you see in every southern city. The old textile mills are being turned into fancy condos with a brewery on the bottom level, right? And so there is talks of turning, kind of redeveloping, not for industrial purposes, of course, but for recreational and tourism, fully redeveloping that falls area.
Like kayaking and stuff.
Right, yeah, exactly. And there's already some kayak tours and stuff going, but they're talking about, enhancing that infrastructure. Any other questions? Yeah.
Have you done any of the scuba archaeology? Anybody?
So I have not. That would be pretty cool. But as far as I'm aware, the last time that anybody has visited any of the wreck sites was in the 1980s. There's a maritime marine archaeology program out of East Carolina University. It's basically the premier program in the country for marine archaeology. And they did several dives during the 1980s. And now the wreck sites are deliberately not openly accessible to the public. So we say 30 miles downriver, but we're on purpose not specifying. Yeah.
It was interesting that a U.S. cavalry was the one to capture them.
Right. Yeah. So sometimes people, the Jackson was in Columbus. It was fully armed. It had the 6 guns, and it was not part of the defense of Columbus. It wasn't part of any of the battle plans. There was no crew on board the Jackson when it was captured. So, there's some armchair quarterbacking going on where people are saying why didn't they try to use the Jackson to fight against the cavalry or whatever. But as far as historians can tell, there just wasn't enough men to crew the ship to even have there was no men trained to even operate the Brooke rifles yet on the Jackson. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you very much.